A few students go to seminary wanting to become an administrator, and Nate was no exception. But during his THM studies, he discovered that administration is exactly what he's wired to do. He now enjoys serving the Lord and DTS students through guiding the seminary's efforts in the areas of accreditation and academic assessment. He also loves helping students learn how to learn and teach others. And outside of DTS, he is very passionate about ministering at Centerpoint Church, where he serves as an elder and co-director of praise and worship, and where he leads a small group with his wife, Noelle. They are the grateful parents of 1 girl and 4 boys who keep them busy and fill their home with Legos, laughter, and lots of love. Nate's family is his greatest joy, easily surpassing his next strongest affection, which is Ohio State football. Go Bucks. That's what it says in here. Well, Nate McKanna, Dr. McKanna, if you could come on up and share a good word for us this morning.
So Luke mentioned my family, and I'm really grateful that they get to be with me here today. Yeah. I'm especially thankful that they're here because today is our wedding anniversary. So there's that, which is obviously always very meaningful, but it's especially so today because you all are here with us. I have the opportunity to be able to share while you are thinking about coming to DTS. And the connection there is that it was 14 years ago that my wife and I got married. We came back from our honeymoon. A few days later, we packed up everything that we owned into our cars, and we drove from Ohio down to Dallas to start our journey here at DTS. We had very little money. We didn't have any jobs lined up. We didn't know a soul. My wife had never even seen our apartment until we moved into it. I'm not going to pretend that it was always easy, that decision that we made to come here to study. There were a lot of times we didn't know where the rent money was going to come from. We've walked through a lot of sorrow in our own family and the lives of people that we love. And yet I can tell you with full honesty, I would not change a thing. Because through all of that, what we have so clearly seen is the faithfulness of God. He has never failed to provide what we needed when we needed it so that we could do what he has called us here to do. And so particularly for those of you who are here in this room thinking about DTS, perhaps those of you online who are thinking the same thing, if I can encourage you, you can trust him. He's faithful. If he has called you here to seminary, he will sustain you through it. And I promise, you are not nearly imaginative enough to fathom all that God can do through a focused time of study in his word in a community with like-minded believers, in particular here at DTS. One of my favorite memories from my time as a student here was receiving this mug from my wife. She got it for me after I graduated with my THM, and it always makes me smile because there are some cute pictures on here of our kids, and makes me think of all that's happened over the last 9 years. So 2 kids are on here, so we've added a few since then. And as those kids are fond of reminding me, I have a lot more gray hair now than I did when this picture was taken. There are also some fun quotes on here that are a constant challenge to me every time I use this. They're from the missionary martyr Jim Elliot. The top one says, "Wherever you are, be all there." I need to hear that over and over. And then there's the bottom one. It says, "Lord, make my way prosperous, not that I achieve high station, but that my life be an exhibit to the value of knowing God." During my THM program, I definitely had the trying to achieve high station part down pat. But it was to make an exhibit to me, not to the Lord. Because you see, I had allowed the world's view of greatness to cloud my vision. My studies were about being noticed. My studies were about making a name for myself. Over the past few years, I'm really grateful for the Spirit's very patient work in my life in this area. And he's done that in large part through the biblical example of John the Baptist. I'm constantly challenged by how he seemed to have all the pieces in place to fit a certain view of greatness, and yet from what little we know of his life, it seems really clear that whatever attention he received, he did his best to redirect that all to Jesus. So as we look briefly at his ministry, my hope for you is that you learn much earlier than I did what your service is for, what any recognition or renown in this life you experience is for, indeed, what your very life is for. As John the Baptist put it so succinctly, he must increase, but I must decrease. It's recorded for us in John 3, verse 30. Now, we love that verse because it's what we all aspire for our lives, right? We want to be followers of Jesus who are committed to bringing all of the attention to him. And yet I suspect many of us are very aware that we are not there yet. I mean, it's not hard for us to want Christ to be seen, for him to be glorified. We've got that part down. It's the second half of the verse that's a little tricky. I think we would be far more comfortable if he had said, he must increase and I along with him, right? Of course, we want Christ to be glorified. But if we're honest, we'd say we'd prefer to be right there in the spotlight with him. What's interesting is that John had to face this same temptation. You might not have noticed it before because we tend to focus just on verse 30 without really looking at a lot of the context that comes around it. So let's start with verse 22 and kind of get into the scene. So we're in John chapter 3. We're going to start in verse 22. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salim because water was plentiful there, and people were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him. Okay, so we see that Jesus and John both have people who are following them, both have people who are being baptized by them. And then in verses 25 and 26, we see that John's followers aren't really happy about this. Did you notice their attitude about Jesus' ministry? Look, he's baptizing, and all are going to him. Now, first of all, is that actually true? No. We saw in verse 23, people are still coming to John. But this statement reveals their heart attitude. They're upset because someone else has come on the scene and is trying to share the spotlight with their leader. When you think about John's resume, it makes sense why they're upset. So his ministry was foretold in the Old Testament. It was foretold by an angel who said he was going to be great in the sight of the Lord. Once his ministry began, he got a lot of attention, including even some people thinking that perhaps he was the Messiah. He had people who were following him, and then even Jesus himself said of John the Baptist that among those born of women there has not risen anyone greater than him. So clearly this is not some ordinary guy. By all accounts, this is an extraordinary servant of God, destined for great things, who deserved the spotlight. So again, it's understandable why John's followers are upset. In their minds, their leader is getting unfairly overshadowed by some other preacher. They want him to do something about it. They want him to do something about this rival who's starting to steal his spotlight. Now, with all that as the background, I think the significance of verse 30 becomes that much clearer. Because if John is some no-name guy, his statement is not going to become the iconic phrase we all know. Shifting the praise to someone else is pretty easy when it doesn't impact your own praise. But what about if you'd lose praise when someone else started to get all the attention? Growing up in the Midwest, like many 90s kids, I was a huge Chicago Bulls fan. And by that, I primarily mean I was a huge Michael Jordan fan. So we got WGN there in my house, and I was able to watch any of the games that I wanted to. And so many nights were spent watching him, and I was just mesmerized. There were days when it seemed like he could not miss a shot. And it was really fun, especially in the 90s during those Bulls runs. It doesn't hurt to be a fan when your team wins 3 straight championships 2 different times in a decade. It's a good time to be a fan. So when a couple years ago a documentary came out about those Bulls teams, I was intrigued. So I thought, well, I was pretty young. Maybe there were some things that I didn't really know were going on. And so I thought, hey, this would be fun to watch. And as you can imagine, it focused primarily on Michael Jordan. That was expected. What I didn't quite expect was the reaction that came from Scottie Pippen. Now, some of you may recognize that name. If you don't, he was Jordan's kind of wingman for all those years, his number 2 guy. He was really good. He wasn't Michael Jordan good, but he was really, really good. And he went everywhere talking to anybody who would listen to him after that documentary came out, complaining about what he felt was unfair attention on Michael Jordan, how he, some others on the team, didn't really get the recognition that they deserved. Now, you know who wasn't on TV complaining about the attention he got in that documentary? Rusty LaRue. You ever heard of Rusty LaRue? No, me neither. Till I looked up these teams. You know why? Because he never started. He averaged about 3 points a game. And yet, he has a championship ring, just like Jordan, just like Pippen. Why wasn't Rusty LaRue going around to anybody who would listen, complaining about the attention he didn't receive in the Last Dance documentary? Well, because in the grand scheme of things, Rusty LaRue was a nobody. He was a guy who rode the bench. He knew that he was entirely dependent on Jordan and Pippen and some of the other stars to get anything that he was going to get out of being on those teams. The team didn't need him. He was totally dependent on them and their accomplishments. Scottie Pippen, on the other hand, was really good. Not quite Jordan good, but still really good, as in the Hall of Fame good, and has a statue of himself at the Bulls arena good. And he took exception to not receiving the recognition that he thought he deserved. Now, if John the Baptist is comparable to that bench player that you've never heard of, I'm not really all that moved by his statement in verse 30. Because of course he'd say Jesus needs to be greater. He clearly is greater and everybody knows it. But John isn't some no-name bench player. We've already seen that he's the cream of the crop. He's an all-time great. And so from an earthly perspective, we would absolutely understand if he's not too thrilled about the fact that Jesus is starting to get all this attention from the crowds. Because if Jesus is getting more attention, then that means that less attention is going to come to John's own greatness. And yet his attitude is exactly the opposite. He must increase, but I must decrease. How did he get to a place where he could say that? Given all his accolades, all the attention that he could have hoarded, how was he able to gladly embrace a ministry that all pointed to Christ? In the rest of this passage, I would suggest that we see 2 things that he understood about his role that will help us as we strive to bring maximum attention to Christ through our lives and through our ministries. The first thing to remember is that our roles are gifts of grace. We see this in verses 27 and 28. John answered, "A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him." John understood that his role as the forerunner of the Messiah was a gracious gift from God. And that perspective made all the difference. There's no jealousy at Jesus' rise in popularity. There's no jockeying for more influence or for more recognition. He didn't need that. He knew his role, and he was secure in it. So all he had to do was live it out, regardless of all the noise that was going on around him. We tend to get this pretty well when we're new in our faith. We remember how unworthy we are, the great depths of God's love and mercy and grace that saved us, gave us an opportunity to play a part in what he's doing. We're happy just to have any role in his kingdom agenda. But then over time, we have a tendency to feel a little bit more entitled about our role. We may forget who we once were, who, if we're honest, in our weakness, we still are. We start to think we're something pretty special. And yet, we don't always have the visibility or the recognition we think we should have. And after a while, we start to notice that there are a whole lot of other people who seem to have better roles. They get to do more things that are up front. They've made quite a name for themselves. And meanwhile, we're kind of over here in our little corner of the kingdom toiling away with what seems like little fanfare and sometimes very little impact. Until we view the roles that we are given as the grace that they are, we are going to be constantly battling this inner voice that wants more attention for ourselves. John Calvin helpfully reminds us that no room is left for taking pride in ourselves when it is by God's grace we are what we are. John the Baptist understood this. His role was a gracious gift to steward, not a status to show off. His role was going to be on serving faithfully, not being in the spotlight. Our roles are gifts of grace. And then second, our joy is most full when Christ is most seen. Look at verse 29. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. John's followers might have been upset that he was losing some visibility, but John had exactly the opposite response. He's not jealous that Jesus is upstaging him. He's thrilled. Because that's exactly what his role was all along, to prepare the way for the coming Messiah. It's like the difference between a nightlight and the sun. A nightlight has a very important role. It gets my kids through the scary darkness of the night. And yet it's always designed to be used for a specific purpose during a specific time. Because once the sun is up, you don't need the nightlight anymore. It would be silly for the nightlight to insist to remain on and be useful when the sun is up. That's not what it's for. It's not needed at that point. You see, John had been a great nightlight. He had served his purpose faithfully for a specified period of time, but now the sun has come and his ministry is fulfilled. It's time for John to step aside and let Jesus shine. And he is not bitter. He's not jealous. He's not grasping for every last bit of attention that he can hold on to. John is overjoyed that Jesus is stealing the spotlight, because that means his mission is complete. Garrett Kell is a DTS grad and a pastor in Virginia who wrote a really helpful blog post a few years ago entitled, "Stop Photobombing Jesus." Now, if you've never heard that term before, photobombing is kind of when you, I think, intentionally or even unintentionally end up in someone else's picture. And so the focus is taken off of them and it's on you because you're sort of awkwardly in the background of a picture that you're not supposed to be in. And Kell gives a number of indicators of what he calls being a, quote, glory thief. Someone who wants to steal the spotlight from Jesus. Here are a few of them. I want to glorify Jesus, but I want glory too. I become bitter when God uses others instead of me. My desire to be something rivals my desire for Jesus to be everything. It's a tension we all wrestle with. We want to be faithful, but we also want to be seen and noticed. May we be content to serve the Lord such that He is in the spotlight, even if we aren't. If we're going to get there, let us heed John's example and remember that our roles are gifts of grace. And our joy is most full when Christ is most seen. I pray that the Lord will indeed make all of your ways prosperous, that you would experience great success in your ministries, that you would have tremendous impact on the kingdom. And yet I also pray that none of that would be for you to make a name for yourself, but to put Christ front and center so that the world may see His worth and the value of giving our lives in service to Him. Let's pray. Father, remind us continually that you have given us all good work to do in your wisdom, in your creativity, and by your immense grace. When we are tempted to compare ourselves to others, when we are tempted to want more of the spotlight, may you remind us that you have given us our role, and that is primarily to bring as much glory and honor and attention and spotlight to our God. May we do so faithfully as we seek to serve you in the days ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.